Hello and welcome to Psychology with me, Mr. Neo. Today we're continuing with aggression, looking at lesson 4, genetic factors in aggression evaluation. We never got the opportunity to evaluate genetic factors, so we're going to recap over some of the genetic factors in aggression and then have a look at some of the evaluative points. So here's the starter. How similar are you to your family in terms of aggression? Is your family typically very calm, or are they always up for a fight? If you are similar, is this evidence that aggression is genetic? Why? Why not? If you are similar to your parents, isn't that just obvious that that must be some sort of genetics then? It must be genetics that play the role. No? Then what is it then? Something to think about. Let's have a look at our learning objectives today. Number 1, show comprehension and recap knowledge of genetic factors in aggression. And learning objective 2, to be able to discuss and evaluate genetic factors in aggression. Let's start with LO1. So recap knowledge of genetic factors in aggression. Genetic factors in aggression, recap. To understand the role of genetic factors in aggression, we have to try and disentangle these influences from those of the environment. Psychologists have several methods for doing this. These include twin studies, adoption studies, and the techniques for investigating the important role of one particular gene, the Mauer gene, also known as the warrior gene. I think gladiator gene would sound cooler. Several twin studies have suggested that heritability or genetic factors account for about 50% of the variance in aggressive behavior. So according to twin studies such as Kokoro et al., they found that aggression was 50% concurrent, or there was a 50% concurrence between monozygotic twins. When one identical twin was aggressive, there was a 50% chance the other one would be quite an aggressive individual as well. That would suggest that aggression has a genetic predisposition of about 50%. However, adoption studies found similar numbers. Similarities in aggressive behavior between an adopted child and their biological parents suggest that genetic influences are operating. Similarities with the adopted parent suggest that environmental influences are operating. So if you've been adopted and you're quite similar to your adopted family, then that will show that there must be environmental influences on the behavior that you're doing, not just aggression, on any behavior. If you're more similar, or you've got some similarities with your biological parents that you've never met before, that must mean that there are some sort of genetic predispositions, genetic influences on your behavior, possibly aggression. Rhee and Waldman carried out a meta-analysis, and they found that genetic influences account for 41% of the variance of aggression, more or less in line with the findings of the twin studies. So the twin studies found a 50% concordance rates between genetics and aggression, and adoption studies found 41%. So they're quite similar. They're in there. So you could argue that genetics contribute to around 40 to 50% of aggressive behavior. But where does the rest of the 50% come from? Monoamine oxidase A is an enzyme. Its role is to mop up neurotransmitters in the brain after a nerve impulse, which has been transmitted from one neuron to another. It does this by breaking down the neurotransmitter, especially serotonin, into constituent chemicals to be recycled or exerted, a process called catabolism. The production of this enzyme is determined by the Mauer gene. A dysfunction in the operation of this gene may lead to abnormal activity in the Mauer gene, which in turn affects the levels of serotonin in the brain. So this Mauer gene can affect the levels of serotonin in the brain. And as we know, serotonin affects your levels of self-control. If you've got low levels of serotonin, you'll not be able to control yourself as well. One variant of the Mauer gene, or Mauer-L, leads to low Mauer activity in the area of the brain, and this has been associated with various forms of aggressive behavior. Brunner studied 28 male members of a Dutch family who were repeatedly involved in impulsively aggressive, violent criminal behaviors such as rape, attempted murder, and physical assault. The researchers found that these men had abnormally low levels of malware in their brain and the low activity version of the malware gene. So that Dutch family would say, yes, the reason why we're why do the accent? Yes, the reason why we're so aggressive is because we got the low malware gene, so I just can't stop raping. Sounds awful. That was an awful accent. Sounds a little bit like Dutch Sean Connery. Yes. Right. Gregory Stewart studied 97 men who, because they had been involved in inflicting intimate partner violence, were part of a batterer treatment program. Men with low activity malware gene were found to be most violent perpetrators of intimate partner violence. Right? So men who had low malware gene activity were found to be more aggressive. This must show that then this malware gene must have some sort of influence in terms of aggression and aggressive behavior. But there are other factors involved as well, interactions such as environment, as it always is. Genes are crucial influences on aggressive behavior, but they do not function in isolation. It appears to be the case that low malware gene activity is only related to adult aggression when combined with early traumatic life events. So the malware gene activity that has been shown to result in aggression is only the case when it has been triggered by a environmental traumatic life event. So I might have that gene and I might never show aggression until a traumatic life event triggers that gene. For example, Frazzetto and others found an association between higher levels of antisocial aggression and the low activity malware gene variant in male adults as expected, but was only the case in those who had experienced traumatic life events such as sexual or physical assault during the first 15 years of life. Those who had not experienced such childhood trauma did not have particularly high levels of aggression as adults, even if those possessed the low activity malware gene variant. This is strong evidence of a gene environment interaction, sometimes described as diathesis stress. And they are the genetic factors in aggression recap, right? So we had a quick look at twin studies, a quick look at adoption studies, and then we had a look at the malware gene specifically, which is the specific gene which has been attributed to a lot of aggression in individuals. And then we had a look at how it might interact with environmental factors as well. So identify one thing you learned about genetic factors in aggression. Why do you think learning about genetic factors in aggression is important? How does genetic factors in aggression apply in real life? And do you have any further questions? If you do, let me know. Now we're going to have a look at to discuss and evaluate genetic factors in aggression. Evaluation. AO3. What are some of the strengths and weaknesses of understanding aggression in terms of genetic factors? So of course there are lots of strengths. You could say there's quite strong evidence, 50%, 41% in some of those studies. However, some of the weaknesses, let's have a look. Okay. Isolating genetic factors. Let's have a look. It has proven remarkably challenging to establish how influential genes are in aggressive behavior. One major reason for this is the difficulty researchers have in separating genetic and environmental factors, as we saw when we looked at genetic and environmental interactions last lesson and this lesson. An individual may possess a gene association with aggression, but the behavior is openly expressed if the environmental conditions are favorable. For example, McDermott and others in 2009 showed that participants with the low activity malware gene behaved aggressively in a lab-based money allocation game, but only when they were provoked. Otherwise, they were no more or less aggressive than any other participants. So it was only when they were provoked, it was only when there was certain specific factors. So is this a strength or a weakness? Well, it's a weakness because it's suggesting that it's not always the case, and genetics are only a partial explanation because there need to be environmental factors as well. Multiple genetic influences. The sizes of genetic effects are statistically significant, but they are also small. This means there are probably other genes involved in aggression. So the Mauer gene was the main gene, but they're suggesting that there are probably other genes as well. In the study by Stewart et al., intimate partner violence in men was associated not just with low activity form of the Mauer gene, but also with the serotonin transporter gene, 5-HTT, another gene that influences serotonin activity in the brain. It was the combination of the two genes that was most closely linked with intimate partner violence, right? So there's this 5-HTT gene, the serotonin transporter gene, which affects the levels of serotonin. As we know, serotonin is a neurotransmitter which affects the levels of self-control we have. If we have low self-control, we can't control ourselves, we can't control our anger, and we're going to get more aggressive. The hunt for other genes is currently a very active research area. Evangelos Vassos et al., Greek, 2014, in a meta-analysis could find no evidence of an association between any single gene and aggression. So he found no specific one gene could be linked to aggression, and it had to be a combination of genes that might lead to aggression. Their explanation for this surprising result is that even several genes are unlikely to fully explain a behavior as multifaceted as aggression. In fact, they calculated that hundreds or even thousands of genes interact in complex ways to determine aggressive behavior, casting doubt on any search for a single candidate gene. So this researcher suggests that actually no one gene can predict aggression, right? That Mauer gene, it needs other genes. It needs an interaction between those genes and environment. It needs an interaction between that gene and other genes to cause aggression. And in fact, no one gene, according to this research, can predict aggression. Is this a strength or a weakness? Well, this is a weakness because it's saying that, well, actually, this gene isn't as strong or as big of a predictor of aggression as we initially have thought. Measuring aggression. Methods of measuring aggression differ significantly between studies and include self-reports, parent and teacher reports, and direct observations. In Ree and Walderman's meta-analysis of 51 twin and adoption studies, genetic factors had a greater influence on aggression in studies using self-reports rather than parent or teacher reports. If research findings vary depending on how aggression is measured, then it becomes very difficult to draw valid conclusions about the role of genetic factors and other factors for that matter. So if you've got all these different studies and they're all measuring aggression in all the different ways, then that affects the validity and reflects the reliability of these studies. They may be reliable, but each study is testing aggression in a different way. Well, if I test aggression in terms of physical aggression or physical assault, and I only deem it aggression when someone is physical and they actually hurt someone or do something like that. Whereas in another study, they go, well, actually, no, I'm going to deem aggression just to be showing aggression, showing anger, maybe gritting their teeth, right? We're measuring two different things here. We're both trying to measure aggression, but we're both coming at it from different angles. Therefore, how can I compare these two studies? How can I say, well, this one showed 52% and this one showed 37%? No, we're having different understandings of aggression here. So measuring aggression in different ways, is that a strength or a weakness? This is a weakness because it's not consistent between each study. There is no specific way of testing aggression. If I was to create a study now, there is no specific way of testing aggression. If I was to have a questionnaire, how aggressive are you? Fine, that might give me a result, but how accurate is it? If I had another situation, if I had to create a situation to cause them to be aggressive, maybe that might be more accurate. But then I've got ethical concerns as well, and also concerns of like time and money. That would cost a lot more time and money. Research support for the role of the Mauer gene. If the low activity variant of the Mauer gene is associated with greater aggression, is the converse also true? Are people with high activity variants more pro-social and less aggressive? So if you've got low activity of the Mauer gene, that's been associated with aggression. You have high activity of the Mauer gene, does that mean you're going to be really social, not aggressive at all? Vanessa Mertens et al. In 2011 studied participants with low activity and high activity variants of the Mauer gene in a money distributing game. Participants had to make decisions about whether or not to contribute money for the good of the group. The researchers found that males with the high activity variant were more cooperative and made fewer aggressive moves than the low activity participants. Question: what does this tell us about the role of the Mauer gene in aggression? Does it increase the validity of the genetic explanations? Is this a strength or a weakness? This is a strength. It's supporting the idea that the Mauer gene plays a role in aggression. Support. Question: what does this tell us about the role of the Mauer gene in aggression? Does it increase the validity of the genetic explanation? This finding confirms the importance of the Mauer gene in aggressive behavior. It shows that possession of the high activity variant leads to the exact opposite behavior to that associated with the low activity variant. The two predictions of the Mauer explanations are opposite sides of the same coin, as both are confirmed by research evidence. This increases our confidence that the genetic explanation is a valid account of how genetics influence aggressive behavior. Yes, this research is supporting the idea of the Mauer gene. Those who had low activity in the Mauer gene were very aggressive, very antisocial. Those who had high activity in the Mauer gene were actually very sociable, less aggressive. And the last evaluative point I got here is non-human animal studies. The hypothesis that the Mauer gene might play a role in human aggression originates in research with mice. Genetic detection techniques allow researchers to knock out single genes, an experimental manipulation that lets them observe subsequent effects on aggression. For example, Goda et al. Showed that Mauer knockout mice have significantly increased brain serotonin levels and are hyper-aggressive. Furthermore, when serotonin was blocked by the drug fluoxetine, the mice reverted to their non-aggressive behavior. What do you think is the significance of the drug-related findings in this study? First of all, is this a strength or a weakness? Well, it depends on how you look at it. This is a strength because it is supporting the idea that Mauer gene affects aggression. However, you could argue this is a weakness because it's suggesting that it was only done on mice. And mice, as we know, aren't humans. We are both mammals, but mice are a lot more simplistic. Humans have a lot more complex brain structure. We have a lot more complex genetics potentially. So it could be a weakness because we can't generalize these findings. I put it as a weakness when I made this. Right. Here we go. Question: what do you think is the significance of the drug-related findings in this study? The finding is important because it highlights the role of serotonin and ultimately the Mauer gene in aggression. It shows that Mauer must normally have some function in relation to serotonin. So it's saying that the Mauer gene or low activity of the Mauer gene must be affecting serotonin. And as we know, serotonin affects your ability to self-control, presumably keeping it at a normal level by removing it from synapses. Malware cannot perform this function in knockout mice. Therefore, they have high levels of serotonin, so are more aggressive. This is an extreme form of low activity malware, i.e., none at all. Just as in humans, the effect is aggressive behavior. Fluoxetine reduces the availability of serotonin in synapses, performing the function normally carried out by malware. This leads to a reduction in aggression to normal levels. So when they took this drug, which reduces the level of serotonin in the synapse, it showed that aggression went back to normal. Here we go. Here's the task. Outline one strength and one weakness of understanding aggression in terms of genetic factors. Answer the question in a Peel paragraph structure. Right, identify one important thing you learned from the evaluation. Why do you think learning about the evaluation is important? And how does the evaluation apply in real life? Have you got any more questions? What are you still wondering about? If you want, put a comment down below. I'll try and answer it. So, have we discussed and evaluated genetic factors in aggression? Yes, we have. Plenary, let's move on to the last task. I've got a multiple choice quiz for you. 6 questions. How can you do? Out of 6. Are you going to be a legend? Are you going to be a noob? Let's find out. Number 1. The proportion of aggression behavior accounted for by genetics seems to be A. Significantly more than 50%. B. About 50%. C. 27%. Or D. Very unclear. Have a think. What would be your answer? Write it down. It's not very unclear, and it's not 27%. It was around 50% is what we found, right? Around 50%. So B. Correct. Number 2, the Mauer gene, A, controls the production of the monoamine oxidase enzyme. B, determines the amount of testosterone in the body. C, operates identically in every individual. Or D, determines the activity of the amygdala. That's got to be A. Surely, right? A. Nice one, me. Number 3, it is difficult to establish the role of genetics in aggression because A, there is little research into this issue. B, most of the research is experimental. C, it is hard to separate genetic and environmental influences. Or D, environmental factors are clearly much more important. I would argue that it's C. It is hard to separate genetic and environmental influences. Good. Number 4, research into genetic factors lacks validity because A, studies use different ways of measuring aggression. B, different variants of the Mauer gene have similar effects. C, genetic factors cannot easily be generalized from one animal to humans. And D, genes and environment have separate effects. Right, write your answer down. Genetic research cannot easily be generalized from animals to humans. That is true, but it doesn't lack validity because of that. It just means it's not generalizable. It lacks validity because studies use different ways of measuring aggression. I hope. Good. 4 for 4. Mr. Neo. Number 5. Low activity of the Mauer gene is associated with aggression. True or false? You always got to remember the low or high, low or high. Low activity resulted in aggression. High activity was more sociable, less aggression. So low activity of the Mauer gene is associated with aggression. True. True. 5 for 5. I'm doing well. Number 6. Oh, come on. Connect the statements in the 2 columns. Right, so we've got the research on the left, and we've got what they found in the research on the right. Kokora et al., Ree and Waldman, Stewart et al., Brunner et al., and McDermott. Right, try and answer those. That is difficult, right? Kokoro found a genetic component to both physical and verbal aggression, right? But more so with the physical and less so with the verbal aggression. Ree and Waldman found that genes accounted for around 40% of the variance in aggressive behavior. So that was the adoption study. Stewart found that men with low activity malware variants were most violent towards their partners. That was similar to the Dutch one. Brunner found that men had low activity variants, found that low activity variant of malware gene. And McDermott found that men with low activity malware variant behaved aggressively only when provoked. Right, how did you do? Decent student, absolute legend possibly? Are you a basic student or are you a noob that needs to go back over the lesson? Right, have a look at the document on the left. So Temper Trap, The Genetics of Aggression and Self-Control by Tom Denson, right? I put a piece of research here for you to check that out. Check it out, see what you think of it, have a little read. And there we go. There's today's lesson, right? Well done, my Neo psychologists. You all did brilliant today. I've been Mr. Neo, carrying on with aggression. I hope that makes sense. And I'll see you soon. Later.